You can hear me better now? Yes. So it's a great pleasure to be here. In fact, my last trip outside of the country was in January 2020 when I came to teach this very course. And then we had something called a pandemic and I didn't go anywhere. And then when Flavi asked me whether I would like to come back, I said, of course I'd like to come back and teach this course again. So, so here I am. And I want to, so before I get started, I just want to say a little bit about my approach to science, which is that I think that ideas are first and foremost. The ideas are what drive science and how we move forward. And what I want to give you more than the details of my lectures is to do research that combines good biological insight and rigorous mathematics, because it's not complete with one or the other, right? So you could be a very good mathematician but not have much insight into biology, and that's really not good science, because you know it's and if you're a biologist, you may have that insight and maybe you wouldn't have the skills, but in a way you could get the skills from someone else. You could go and say, I have this idea, I don't know how to do it, could you help me do the mathematics, right? But the other side of it is actually not as true. Like it's hard to kind of say, tell somebody, give me the biological insight and I'll develop a model. So one of the things that's important and is to really have your models be rooted in the biology of the system. Take some trouble to learn about it, okay? And sort of there's this thing, because I'm on both sides, I see sometimes mathematicians and physicists sort of thinking like, these biologists, you know, they don't know how to do this stuff, let's teach them. But it's not actually true, because, you know, they are experts, biologists are experts in their field. And the physicists don't know biology, right? So in the same way, we don't think that, you know, okay, just because a biologist doesn't have the same grasp of mathematics or physics that a physicist or mathematician does, that does not make them inferior, right? So this is not the crowd I should be telling this to, because you're all very bright and you can do everything very well. But it's true that sometimes there is this feeling that somebody else needs to come and help you do this. But it's actually a mutual feedback system. Both sides need to work together. And if you do everything yourself, like I mostly do, I try to be a good biologist when I develop models. But being a mathematical biologist also makes me a much better experimentalist, because I know what to test, I know how to think about it ahead of time, and I know what not to do, and what, you know, if the assumptions are such that you choose the right system, right? So that's the kind of the larger message I want to leave you with. The details you can get from my lectures, you can look them up, but that's a very important thing, this integration of the two. And so in order to do good science, you need to be a good, you know, it has to be both good biology and good mathematics, okay? So the other thing I want to say is that the way, as I said, like I'm really kind of very focused on ideas. So my approach is to try to discover, elucidate mechanisms from first principles. Right? So there is a practice nowadays which has become more popular, which is that you use statistical models to infer mechanisms from the data, and then you use some part of the data to validate or test your predictions. But the way I do it is different. I try to develop the mechanisms from the first principles of the problem. Sometimes that might be something like thermodynamics, right? And then I make predictions that are independent of the data, so you can go and test the predictions of your models. The model is based on ideas, first principles, and then you go test the model with the data, right? And it's independent, it's very powerful, because you're not using the data to validate the model and then to test the predictions of the model with the data, okay? And so this is, it's sometimes harder to do, because mechanisms are harder to come up with from first principles. It's easier to be guided by the data, say, let's work backwards from the data, right? But that's not a very powerful approach, because you're just working backwards from that data set. So if you want to be more general, you want to develop theory that sort of stands withstands the test of time. Somebody could look back and say, you know, we use very simple models, like the Rothko-Volter models. They really don't apply anywhere to a specific system, but they've endured because of their generality, right? Because they take out the details, they preserve the essence. And that's what you want to do to a certain extent. If you want to study a particular system, and you really want to understand that system, then you do something more specific, geared towards that system, okay? So hopefully you can do both. Like I try to do both, more general theory, but some, you know, also focused on this insect system I've studied, for example. All right, so the theme I want to focus on is this interplay between nonlinearity and variability. So I focus on this because that's really fundamental to ecology and evolution. We care in ecology about the maintenance of diversity. If you go back to evolutionary biology and population genetics, 300, 200 years afterwards, we still ask the question, what maintains genetic variation? That has not changed despite all the knowledge we've accumulated, right? So ultimately we are after this question, what generates variation? What generates diversity? So my thesis is that it's this interplay between nonlinearity and variability. So we are looking at it from the broadest, the most conceptual way possible, and then we sort of try to understand these elements and their interaction so you can come up with these mechanisms. So let me just define what these two themes are. Nonlinearities, you know what nonlinearities are, it's not a line anymore, right? It's some squiggle, and you can't really predict what would happen in the future because it's not proportional, right? So nonlinearities in biology arise from biotic factors, meaning things like other species, right? And these generate density or frequency dependence in fitness. So there is a dependence of fitness on the density or the frequency of the organism. And here fitness is defined as the per capita growth rate. You see lots of examples in my lectures to come, okay? And variability arises. So this is a very important distinction. Nonlinearity arises from biotic factors. They cannot be generated by abiotic factors. What are abiotic factors? Rainfall, temperature, because they're outside the feedback structure of a biological system. But what abiotic factors do is something very important. They can generate spatial or temporal variation in the density or frequency dependence of fitness, okay? So that's, and also by the way, you have these notes. These slides, you will get them as a PDF file. So you can listen and ask questions. And also I forgot to say, I know that we have a range of students from PhDs to undergraduates. And I want to be able to reach all of you, right? And which means that some of you who know this stuff might be a little bored. And you know, but then others might still be wondering, I don't actually know that. So you can always stop me. I have tried to be cognizant of this to sort of make the lectures where I try to explain everything. But at any time you can say, put your hand up and say, I don't quite understand what that term means, okay? So just so before I forget. All right, so then, this interplay between this nonlinearity and variability is what generates the large scale patterns we see in nature. So say the latitudinal gradient in diversity. This is something we're still trying to understand, right? It's actually ultimately the result of this interplay. The interplay is a harder thing because they are individually, the nonlinearities and the variabilities themselves are complex things. But this is what we are after. This is our ultimate goal. We all, if you're interested in these kinds of subjects, even in other parts of biology, say cellular, molecular biology, this is really kind of what you are, because the ultimate goal, why do we want to study molecular biology? Ultimately to understand biological systems. Why do we want to understand biological systems? We want to know how they persist. And if they're in danger of extinction, we want to know how to stop them, right? All right, so, and how do we do this? We use mathematical models to understand the mechanistic underpinnings of this interplay between nonlinearity and variability. And through this mechanistic understanding, we can both explain the patterns we see in nature that we find puzzling and predict how those patterns might change in the face of perturbations, disturbances things that we can't, we know these things, climate change, pollution, habitat destruction. It's not very intuitive as to how things may change as a result of these perturbations. Each one is different, right? So like for example, climate change is what we call a non-stationary perturbation, meaning the perturbation itself changes over time, right? So it's very difficult to understand. So if we understand what happens, we can understand what happens now and describe what it is now, we can predict what would happen in the future, okay? All right, so this mechanistic theory is not simply important for understanding basic scientific principles and using them to explain and predict complex patterns. They are also important in applied problems such as conservation, invasive species, and climate warming. So my lectures for this week are going to be under these two themes, where the first one is, and which I will start to talk about today, is non-linearity in the absence of any variability. What is this thing? What does it do and what doesn't it do? The second one then is to understand this interplay between non-linearity and variability, and we look at these two dimensions, spatial, the major dimensions, spatial, space and time, okay? Right, so why is it important to study nonlinear dynamics in the absence of variability, apart from the fact we have to know that to know what the interaction is? It's a fundamental driver of dynamics and diversity. There will be no variability if there's non-linearity, no non-linearity, because if everything is linear, we can predict the future. We don't have to worry. Our intuition's just fine. But the fact is that things are not linear, and our intuition almost always fails, right? We can't say what would happen even in a year from now, right? Right, so now, what is nonlinearity? It actually has a fairly formal definition, not just that those squiggles actually have an underlying mathematical meaning. They arise due to negative or positive feedback, and this feedback arises from density or frequency dependence. So in the case of biological systems, right, they arise from, you have feedback systems like a thermostat. That's a feedback system, right? Your thermostat, when it's hot, you make it cold, the thermostat makes it, because there's a set point. So it comes up, right? And then when it's hot, cold, the temperature rises to the set point. That's a feedback. What kind of feedback is that? That's a negative feedback, because things are brought back to some set point. And in our world, that's some attractor, some persistent equilibrium where species exist at positive densities, right? And also like the other one I like is, you know how you take a shower in the morning and you turn the tap on, it's too cold, right? And you keep turning it, and guess it's too hot, and then you do it. Same when you're trying to ride a bicycle. You understand, you collect the course until you're at the set point, right? Right, so that's these feedback mechanisms. In ecology, we really focus a lot on density-dependent feedback mechanisms. If you go to population genetics and evolution, phenotypic evolution, a lot of times it's frequency dependence. This is something I would like you to think about. Why is it that in most of evolutionary biological questions we focus on frequency dependence, but in ecological questions we mostly rely on density dependence? They're not the same thing, as you know, right? Frequency is the abundance divided by the total abundance. But why is it so different? So that's a different question, not for today, but maybe something for you to think about. But today we are going to focus on density-dependent feedback mechanisms, which are negative and positive, right? So the negative density dependence, this is really very important because it is the process, no matter how it arises, it's the process that underlies stable coexistence. It allows species to increase when they are rare and to decrease when they are abundant, just like your thermostat, right? And exactly, as I said, just I got ahead of myself. And it leads to what we call attractors in dynamical system theory, which is, in biology, we call a coexistence equilibrium, because instead of things going extinct, they go towards some long-term positive abundance where all species have positive long-term abundances, right? An equilibrium that's an attractor, because not all equilibria are attractors, as you know, right? You can go away from an equilibrium. Sometimes it's a saddle point, sometimes it's a repeller, okay? Right. So let's now go through a formal definition of density dependence. It is, we define density dependence when the per capita growth rate is an increasing or decreasing function of density, obviously, right? But so say if population dynamics are given by this equation, this simple ordinary differential equation, dn over dt is equal to n times some function of n. And that's your per capita growth rate. And it is some function of density. We don't know whether it's positive, negative, we don't know whether it's linear, non-linear, but it's a function of density. That's the formal definition of density dependence, nothing else. And that's something that has tripped up people for a very long time. You could say, oh, there's density dependence. You know, if you had dn dt over, like, say, times b times n, people might say, well, that's density dependent, but that's not. The per capita growth is. So let me illustrate this with, let's start with density independent population growth. I mean, this is stuff you've all known for a long time, but let's just go through it. So let's think about the exponential model for population growth, right? That's actually dn over dt equals r times n, where r is some intrinsic growth rate. If you take the per capita growth rate, it's independent of density, and which is why exponential growth just increases or decreases without bound, right? Obviously. Then let's just take our famous logistic model for population growth. Now we have this term 1 minus n over k. So such that when you take the per capita growth rate, then now n is a declining, sorry, a per capita growth rate is a decreasing function of density. And this is about the simplest case of negative feedback. It's a linear, you know that, right? Like that's a line, right? If you plot dn dt versus n, that's the actually mx, y equals mx plus c, right? And in fact, here's something I would like you to do. If you work this out, you can work out what the intercept and just using mx plus c, which is, I mean, a trivial exercise, but it's interesting because people don't actually look at it and say, hey, that's y equals mx plus c, but it is. So it's linear density dependence, but it is density dependence, right? Right. So now, what is this thing called negative density dependence? Here's where the biology comes in. Because we are not talking about the thermostat, we're talking about individuals, species, populations. So it arises from what we call self-limitation. Species limit themselves, they are limited, right? And usually, how does that, so this is how I like to think. I keep asking questions until I get to the bottom of this jargon. So here's negative density dependence. Those are 3 words that you tell that to like a high school students, like what? Right? But then you say, well, that's some way of, you know, one way of like things, entities limit themselves. Well, what does that mean? But everybody can understand if you talk about competition within individuals of a species for limiting resources. For food, shelter, we all see this in, you know, real life, right? There's one fact of life that never changes is resources are always limiting. We don't have enough to go around. Right? And this is what started Darwin thinking about all these things by reading this essay by Thomas Malthus, where he talked about this limitation. So that is getting to the bottom of it, right? We use fancy words, but what that means is ultimately resources, food, shelter, mates, nesting sites, those are limiting. So not everybody can have access to those, and that generates this negative feedback. So when the resources are limiting, if there are more individuals, you come down to the point at which there is enough for everyone. If it's below that, you increase because, of course, now there's more than a given individual needs, okay? Everybody's happy. So is everybody happy with this so far? Yeah? Good. So that's negative density dependence. Now let's talk about positive density dependence. It gets a little tricky sometimes. All right. So here, obviously, now per capita growth rate is an increasing function of density. How many people have heard of this thing called alley effects? Yeah, so it's just a term again, right? Named after the person who first sort of thought about it. His name was W.C. Alley. So, but what it means is that you can get this thing where the per capita growth rate decreases with decreasing density, right? So, what is negative feedback is per capita growth rate decreases with increasing density. But if you have per capita growth rate decreasing with decreasing density, you are going towards extinction, right? So, that is very commonly observed or demonstrated or models made of in single species where you do not have, say, the population has only males. There is no way you are going to reproduce, right? So, you are going to basically die. And in mutualistic interactions where you need, say, a plant needs a pollinator, and if the pollinator abundance falls below a certain threshold where the plant can't actually fertilize all of its seeds, and that happens on a population scale, the population will go extinct, right? So, these things are fairly known. Now, what's less well known is this idea about saturating or type 2 functional responses in consumer resource dynamics. Now, generally, typically, unless you put in an alley effect, you can't get positive feedback. Generally, people think in consumer resource dynamics, but actually you can. This is a subtle one. So, I want to teach you about this one. So, what is, if you have I'm going to explain what a saturating functional response is, but basically what happens is when you have what's called a saturating functional response, you have actually a very subtle form of positive feedback which generates consumer resource oscillation. So, everybody knows this, right? Consumer resource systems tend to fluctuate in abundance. Purely competitive systems tend to not do that. Purely mutualistic systems tend not to generally do that, at least in our models, because nothing in nature is isolated from one, or another. But we know this, you have, say, just even the Lotka-Volterra model, you at least get neutral cycles, right? You get a, because of this antagonistic interaction. One species is chasing the other one is running, the prey is running away, the predator wants. So, they have a conflict of interest that can generate these. We can talk about that in detail later. What is a functional response? It's what's called the per capita consumption. So, I want to make sure everybody understands this, okay? So, if you haven't heard this before, do not worry, you can also look it up. But it's the per capita consumption rate. Per capita is the number of prey consumed by a single predator, okay, per unit time. This is not per resource, this is per predator, meaning a single predator can eat more than 1 unit of resource, okay? Keep that in mind. And a type 2 functional response looks like this, where that per capita consumption rate or the functional response saturates at high resource density. Here's our first non-linearity, well, aside from the logistic model, which is, So, you have a function, I will explain this in a second, but you have something like that. We know at, first glance, there's an R at the bottom, which is going to make this is like 1 over x, right? That's not linear. So, we already know, and it looks like that when you plot it. So, what happens? The consumption rate increases, but the rate at which it increases decreases with increasing density, right? So, you have eventually it just becomes plateaus, right? Now, how does this happen? It happens because organisms have something called a handling time. Here's where the biology comes in. You can always put an equation. I mean, it's easy to write anything nonlinear, right? We can just make up one, but it has to mean something here, and it actually came from observations of these responses. Somebody actually looked at Holling, for example. He looked at these things and said, when I do this, they look like this. The functional response, what is it? It's because they have something called a handling time. So, think about it. So, any organism, you say like a, I don't know, herbivore, a deer eating grass, it has to chew that thing or capture. So, like, something, a predator capturing a prey, a spider capturing a fly. You have to go get this thing, inject something, make it into liquid, ingest it, and that takes time. So, you go and find something, but it doesn't instantaneously go inside, right? And this handling time can be very short for certain things. You go gobble something up. Or the search time is larger, in other words, but the handling time is short. Or like imagine otters. otters, when they eat like bivalves, what do they have to do? You can't eat the big calciferous shell. They have to go pound it on a stone. That takes a bit of time, even for otters. So there is a thing called a handling time. A is the attack rate or the search rate. That's you look for your prey, you find it, you get it, but you have to do some handling. That handling time is what generates this saturation setting functional response. What's important is if you look at it, the resource is actually underexploited when it's low, okay? And basically, opposite. The resource is underexploited when it's abundant, which is really the opposite of a negative feedback if you think about it, right? Remember the thermostat, when something is too high, you want to bring it down. This thing doesn't do it, it just stops working because it becomes constant, right? So what this does is a very interesting thing. Because the resource is underexploited when it's abundant, there is positive feedback in the resource species per capita growth rate. Think about it. The functional response is in the consumer, right? It has this natural thing. And also another thing about this saturation is there's something called gut capacity. Now everybody knows that, right? You go to a party, it's Christmas, there's all this food. But after a while, no matter how much food is there, you just can't eat anymore. Satiation, like you wish you could, but you can't, right? So there's a gut capacity, there's a limitation, a fundamental constraint of gut capacity. So parasites, parasitoids which lay their eggs in other insects' bodies, they have a thing called egg limitation. If you have no more eggs, you really can't parasitize, right? So you have this fundamental constraint. So these things are what this, so it's not just mathematics. There's a very important biological principle. So now let's think about this. And to do this, I'm going to take you through this very simple pairwise consumer resource interaction. So this is the resource equation. It has logistic growth. I've substituted Q for 1 over K because I like to think of it as the per capita competition coefficient. Because see, the carrying capacity, if you ever try to do an experiment, you will never can measure. This is an elusive quantity. How do you measure a carrying capacity in the real world? We don't know what that is. We can never take the organism out and say, hey, plants, grow, I'll measure you. You can't. So I like to think of it as the per capita competition coefficient, which is actually what you measure in the lab. It's the per capita effect that an individual has on other individuals by taking up the resource, okay? So anyway, so I like to use Q, but it's the only one okay. So, and then you have that type 2 functional response with the attack rate and the handling time. And that's the functional response. The per capita growth rate of the consumer is called the numerical response because the consumption translates ultimately into consumer reproduction, right? And that increases consumer numbers. Now, that translation is now perfect because there's the thing called conversion efficiency. We know that much of what we eat is actually not assimilated, right? And that's true for anything. That not all the energy is assimilated, some of it is lost as heat, some of it is just simply not absorbable. So E scales that conversion of the food into actual energetic units or offspring of the consumer. Everybody understands that, right? If E is 1, there's a 1-to-1 correspondence. For most predators, it's much less than 1, like us. We eat stuff, we don't actually assimilate everything we eat. A lot of it is just goes to waste, right, as sort of excretory matter. For parasites, it's much greater than 1 because one parasite can have a lot of offspring within one host. And so it's really, you know, for ease of mathematics, we might say, hey, just let's assume it's 1, but it's generally not. Anyway, so the most important thing is we have resource self-limitation and a type 2 or saturating functional response. Now let's look at the resource species per capita growth rate of the resource species there's no self-limitation in the resource. So now we only have R. The Q part has disappeared. This is exponential growth in the resource in the absence of the consumer, but we have the consumer exerting a type 2 functional response. What you can see is there's now positive feedback in the resource species per capita growth rate. Can you see So I is a constant, right? But what happens to that term when H increases? It looks like that, right? It keeps, this becomes smaller and smaller, which means you are actually going to increase more and more because the decrement from I is smaller as you, so because, that's what happens here. Everybody understand that, right? So if you look at this term, the smaller it is, the larger the per capita growth rate, right? So the higher the R, what happens? The smaller this is. So as resource density increases, the per capita growth rate increases, right? So you see that, right? Yeah.
Hi, I don't understand what you mean by no self-limitation in resource.
Oh, here. So in this equation, self-limitation means the resource has that Q term. Right? Here.
Can you repeat, please?
Q, that's 1 over K. Right? That's logistic growth in the resource in the absence of the consumer. If you set Q to 0, what does this become? R times R, right? That's what I'm looking at for the first pass. So we are asking, if you have no self-limitation in the resource, what happens to the resource species per capita growth rate? It looks like that. You can plot this for yourself. Okay?
But would that self-limitation include competition?
Yeah. But that we are saying, just as a first part, let's say there's no self-limitation. The resource grows exponentially, and that's possible, right? This is just for you to show what's happening. So now what happens is that the resource per capita growth rate is an increasing function of resource density, which means you actually have positive feedback. It's not something people talk about. So this is not what you call an alley effect, right? It doesn't look the same. But it actually generates a positive feedback. That's a very important point that has not been actually noted in the literature. So there is a subtle positive feedback. We've seen proof of it. But now, let's add the negative feedback. Now this is the full equation. Look what happens to the per capita growth rate now. It becomes this parabola, right? So here, let's try to understand that. Now, you have a negative feedback due to resource self-limitation. You have positive feedback due to the consumer's saturating functional response. Does everybody agree? Because once we took this out, look, it's positive. But see, this curve, what happens to this curve? When the resource density increases and we add self-limitation, this curve comes down. What is that? A thermostat, right? Because once you add, so look, here's positive feedback. Everybody agrees with that, right? What happens when you put the 1 minus QR term back? It was increasing like that. Now it's coming down. Why is it coming down? Because when the resource abundance is high, the resource is limited by its own limiting factors, right? Like nutrients, water, sunlight. Yes?
By feedback, do you mean that the consumer handling time is also going to change? It's going to
get
bigger?
Here, so that is, we already had that, right? The handling time. Now we are saying I'm going to add the Q here. Okay? What happens is, okay, let me explain this. So look at what happens. When the resource abundance is rare, you have positive feedback, right? It's increasing. Because why? When the resource abundance is low, is the resource limited by its own nutrients or water or light? No. So the resource will. So in this phase, so you can see that this curve has a maximum at a critical resource density that we call RC. Below that, there's positive feedback. Why? Because the consumer's control on the resource is stronger than resource self-limitation, right? Because there's no resource self-limitation, the resource is growing almost exponentially, like what we saw here. This is that part. See? This part. When it's low, you have that. What is changes when you add self-limitation is what happens to the high part, right? That saturating part. Now, so that keeps happening, but at a certain point, remember, when the resource density increases, what does the saturating functional response do? The consumer becomes less and less efficient at controlling the resource because its consumption rate plateaus into a constant, right? So what does that mean? The resource is escaping consumer control, right? But since resource abundance is high now, what happens? The resource species becomes limited by its own limiting factors, correct? Here's this interplay between negative and positive feedback is a very important thing. If we spend the rest of the hour talking about it, it would still be worth it. Hopefully not though. That way I won't get to cover all my lectures. But so now the negative feedback starts to kick in, and this thing that was going like that now starts to, I would say, you should get together, just plot these things in your favorite program, and you can see this for yourself, right? Now, so what happens is, below this critical threshold, positive feedback is stronger than negative feedback. The system oscillates in abundance because you have these periods where the resource escapes, then the consumer comes back because the resource is now coming down, goes, and you get the limit cycle oscillations. That's typical of this model. But when the resource abundance is higher, exceeds that, then the negative feedback kicks in, resource self-limitation becomes stronger than the destabilizing effect of the consumer's functional response, and you get a stable focus. A stable focus is an attractor that's reached via damped oscillations, right? It's really fun to look at, like, if you want to plot this, it's really fun to look at the time series, what happens, just for the fun of it. So that's what we get. You see that there is positive feedback inherent in the saturating functional response. It's a subtle form of positive feedback. It's not like the alley effect, but it is still there because you see that it saturates at certain points, so not like an alley effect. But here what it does is not necessarily extinction, but to generate these oscillations, because the consumer is pretty bad at controlling the resource when the resource abundance is high. But if the resource is then limited by its own limiting factors, then you actually have this. And then you have this bifurcation called a HOPF, H-O-P-F, where the chalks. Where the system moves from a limit cycle to a stable focus, or you go the other way, you go from a stable focus to limit cycles. Right, so the non-linearities here are twofold. This is an ideal system where you get both negative density dependence due to self-limitation and positive density dependence due to the saturating functional response. Now then, so how do these mechanisms underlying non-linearities arise? Where do these things come from? They come from, these feedback processes arise from interactions between species, right? Here we just saw a very good example. Even an interaction within a species in terms of intraspecific competition is an interaction outside of a single individual. Individuals don't exist in isolation. They interact with members of their own species, members of other species, right? So generally, resources tend to induce negative density dependence because resources are limiting by, it's a fundamental factor of life, and there's not enough to go around. Natural enemies can induce positive density dependence because this satiation or saturation is a fundamental constraint of all consumers, because you either have a limited gut capacity or you just take time to handle your prey. It is what we call a constraint. It makes impossible something that should otherwise be possible, okay? Because your gut is limited by basically mechanics of your body form, right? Or the number of eggs that a parasitoid can lay is limited by its own energetic reserves, its size, the kind of form of parasitism, etc. So that's what we call a constraint. So constraint is a very important thing. It's as opposed to selection, for example. Constraint is something that will prevent things from otherwise possible from happening. For example, going to some outcome that would otherwise be impossible. A very good example is insects. Why are insects not larger? They're just more numerous, but you know why? They have spiracula, they respire through these things called spiracles at the periphery of their bodies. If it's too large, diffusion just doesn't work as well, right? Insects have become much more dominant by becoming more numerous and diverse, but not by large size, right? So that's a very good example. All right, we can talk about that kind of thing till we get tired. All right, so now our goal, that was an introduction, is to elucidate these mechanisms by which non-varieties in species interactions influence diversity. That's the very first thing. When I say influence, I don't mean increase. I mean either increase or decrease, okay? Now, another thing that's very common in the literature and even in lectures, diversity is just an outcome. What is diversity? You count species, right? That's an outcome. That's not a mechanism. The mechanism is coexistence, and when we say coexistence, we imply something that generates an outcome that we consider as diverse, okay? So that's something simple but very important, like the thing about the positive feedback in the functional response, which most people actually are not even aware of, right? And of course, what are species, the different types of species interactions? We have exploitative competition and what's called a parent competition, which I will explain. They tend to be competitive interactions, so mutually negative, right? We have mutualistic interactions, which are typically mutually positive. And then we have consumer resource interactions, which are very interesting because they're antagonistic, right? One species benefits, the other species harmed by the interaction. So there's a conflict of interest always. And anytime you have a conflict of interest, you have really interesting dynamical outcomes, evolutionary outcomes, co-evolutionary outcomes. So in these kinds of systems is where you have the red queen, the sort of the cycling and co-evolutionary cycling and these kinds of oscillations in ecological time. All these things come because of that conflict of interest. The prey is always wanting to escape. The predator is always wanting to capture, right? The resource has a beneficial effect on the consumer. The consumer has a negative effect on this. So they need to, so there is really no way that they can actually, each one can win. If the resource is winning, so to speak, it just has to eliminate predation. But then the predator can't survive. So you have this thing, right? So it's those are. So okay, so we are going to go through these different ones. And we're going to start with exploitative competition. And there's also this really important thing about exploitative competition. It actually consists of indirect interactions between individuals of the same or different species as a result of acquiring a resource that's in limiting supply. The indirect part is really important. So each individual negatively affects other individuals solely by reducing the abundance of the resource. So my favorite example of this is, it's like the early bird gets the worm thing, right? So, there's a pile of resource, whatever. It's a seeds for little rodents or pile of worms for birds. One individual, let's say, goes early and gets a big share, right? It never meets the other individuals, never interacts with them. But if by virtue of having got that big share, it has deprived other individuals of the same access to the resource had this individual not been one who gets up early, right? So you see, it is not necessary for them to interact directly. Now there is something called interference competition, which to put it colloquially is when you just beat the other guy up. They go get up early, they get the resource, they're coming back home, you just waylay them, beat them up and take it. That's a direct interaction, right? Pretty much that's what happens like with territoriality and things like that. It's very different. There's a cost, actual physical cost to that interaction. But exploitative competition where you really don't have to interact at all, okay? So that's very important. So here's an example. I'm going to use this interaction where you have two consumer species and they compete for this resource. So, you have a consumer resource interaction pairwise with each species and then they compete for this resource. Okay, and I am going to use a very, very simple model with type 1 functional responses, and I have written it so that the quantity in brackets is each species per capita growth rate. Okay. So, the resource has logistic type self-limitation, type 1 functional response. Now, there is no handling time. We are just doing this because it's the derivations are a lot easier. Okay. And then each consumer then has that functional response times its conversion efficiency and a mortality term. And here are two consumers, they have different parameter values. Okay. Now, there are two criteria that need to be satisfied for coexistence. So, we are asking the question of can these two consumers coexist on that resource which itself has explicit dynamics, right. This is not the Locker-Volterra model where we represent the resource through a carrying capacity. This is actually we are looking at the dynamics of that resource species. Okay. So, it is a bit harder, but it is actually much more natural, realistic. So, you have two criteria. One is mutual invasibility. This is the idea that each species must be able to increase when from initially small numbers when its competitor is at some steady state with the resource. So, you have this pairwise interaction between a resource and a consumer, and they are they are persisting at their steady state, and you are asking can a second species coming in at small numbers increase when where when the resident consumer has the best advantage, right. It's basically the worst case scenario for the invading species. So, but that's actually only a necessary condition for coexistence. That itself is hard enough a lot of times, but the sufficient condition is that if a coexistence equilibrium exists, meaning that either species can invade the other species at equilibrium with the resource when they exist in small numbers, that coexistence equilibrium must be stable to perturbations. So, this first one we call is a feasibility condition. Mutual invasibility makes a coexistence equilibrium feasible, that it has the potential to exist. The stability condition determines if it exists, is it stable. And here stability means in the mathematical sense, if you were to perturb the system from that equilibrium by changing the abundances by a small amount, will the system return to that, right. So, it's we are asking the question, is this coexistence equilibrium an attractor? Okay. So, those are the two things we are going to work out, and to determine mutual invasibility, we have to compute what are called invasion criteria. So, basically just if you write it out, this says that consumer I, so I could be 1 or 2, can invade when rare if it can maintain a positive per capita growth rate when its competitor, which is consumer J, 1 or 2, is at equilibrium with the resource. It's exactly what I said. I'm just writing it out here. So, this you have this for your notes, right. Now, when you compute the invasion criteria, we quantify something called the R star. This is a very important idea. R star, a given consumer species R star is the resource level required for that species to just maintain itself. So, this is the resource level at this species birth balances mortality. You are just maintaining yourself. You are not increasing, you are not decreasing. That is called R star. Okay? And this will become important when we analyze the model. So, here is a model. We are going to compute the invasion criteria. So, here we say we are starting, let us say consumer J, whichever it is at equilibrium with the resource when its per capita growth rate is 0, right. That is when births balance deaths, right. We agree? Right. And then R star is the resource level at which this equation is this equality is satisfied. right? R star. So, what is the R star? R star is the resource level at which the per capita growth rate is 0. So, we can solve for the R star, right? We set this thing to 0 and we solve for R star, right? Everybody agree? Right. There. We set it to 0 and then we find out the R star for the consumer J is given by the ratio of its death rate to its birth rate. Now, why is this the birth rate? Because the attack rate itself is not the birth rate, it has to be weighted by the conversion efficiency, right? There is no handling time this time because it's much easier, much nicer to see the R star without a handling time, which we will, we can deal with that later. But you can see it's really nice, it's the death to birth ratio. The R star is the death to birth ratio, right? Now, so here is a summary of all that what I said when you go back and look at your notes. Now, so now we have calculated the R star of the resident species, right? The species that's in equilibrium with the resource. But we actually have to look at the invading species. So, we have to now calculate the invasion criterion for consumer I. Remember, consumer J is at equilibrium with the resource, right? We are asking, can consumer I invade when it's rare, while consumer J is at equilibrium. So, if we write down consumer I's per capita growth rate, it's that, and what is the R star? R star is the equilibrium abundance to which consumer 1 reduces the resource, right? And that we calculated to be R star Cj is equal to this thing, and I'm sorry, there should be an equal sign here. I only discovered this morning. But then once you substitute for R star, you get this equation on the right hand side. So, basically what then our criterion is invasion criteria for consumer I is that consumer I can invade a community consisting of the resource and consumer J when its per capita growth rate when rare is positive. All we have to show is that this thing is positive. Now, what does it consist of? It consists of the invading species conversion efficiency, attack rate and death rate, and the resident species conversion efficiency, attack rate and death rate. Those are things you can measure, right? So, here we have an invasion criterion phrased in terms of all the important parameters of the two species. Now, we can calculate the mutual invasibility criteria. So, the consumer 1 can invade when rare, when that inequality is satisfied, per capita growth rate is positive, where R star C2 is that, and it's a kind of a mirror image. For consumer 2 can now invade when rare, that's mutual invasibility, right? You always have to show both criteria and show that they both can be met. So, here is the same thing for the other species, where R star C1 is this thing, right? And you can always see it's the death to birth ratio. Now, we can rewrite this as follows. Consumer 1 can invade when rare if that inequality is met. Consumer 2 can invade when rare when that inequality is met. What do you see? If that's met, this cannot be met, right? If this is met, that cannot be met. So, these invasion criteria are mutually exclusive. If one species can increase when rare, the other species cannot. Now, if you didn't understand the derivation or any of it, you can always go back and work it out. Get a friend to help you, work in a group. Most important thing here is this thing, which is really the competitive exclusion principle, but expressed in a way that's very strongly biologically rooted, and a metric called the R star that you can compute across species. Forget all the details. You can always work it out. You can look all this stuff up in a book, plus in my lectures, right? That's not what matters. What matters to me is that you understand the idea behind it. Any species, when it's rare, should be able to increase from small numbers when its competitor is at equilibrium, some steady state. Don't even think about an equilibrium. It exists out there and it's not going extinct, right? Everybody understands that. But the fact is our intuition about it is not good enough, right? We cannot predict whether that species can increase. So we need some simple mathematics, right? It's the simplest possible model we could come up with. But it comes up with this very important idea, which is that you have this kind of rule that essentially is a kind of a formal definition of Gauss's competitive exclusion principle. We call this the R-star rule. It actually was first proposed by Alan Hastings, who's the theoretical ecologist at UC Davis, but popularized much later by David Tillman. So this rule states that the consumer species that drives the resource abundance to the lowest level will win. Why? Nobody else can persist at that level. You understand that? Each species needs a resource level at which it can at least balance births and deaths. You understand this, right? Any population. So whoever has the lowest requirement, meaning you're very efficient, you can do with very little. A species that's very efficient, it doesn't need a lot of resource to persist. That species is going to always win, right? Because it's going to reduce the resource to a level that nobody else can persist. Are we happy with that? Good. All right. Any doubt? Just the words, not the equations. Equations can be worked out. The idea is important. Okay? Good. How long am I allowed to go on till you drop dead? Sorry. Yeah. 12:30. Are you tired? Not yet. Okay. Let's go till 12:30. You have a question. Good.
Just to be sure that I'm following.
Yeah.
You started saying that necessary condition is mutual invisibility.
Yeah.
But you finished showing that the criteria that we have from this consumer resource model is exclusive
Exactly.
criterions, criteria.
Yeah. So we are saying in this case, what are we getting at? This non-linearity is not sufficient to allow coexistence, right? Remember what I started with? I said, let's look at the cases in which non-linearity in dynamics alone can allow coexistence in the absence of any variability. Remember our argument? So here we are heading for a situation, and in fact you stole my slide, you anticipated my slide, my conclusion slide. Thank you for that. It's a good, very good question. See, there's no such thing as not a good question. In the politically incorrect days, we used to say there's no such thing as a stupid question, but you don't say that. What's like a thing like a challenge? I don't know, forget it. So here, summary. In the case of exploitative competition, where remember these indirect interactions to procure a resource, and the environment is constant. Remember, there's no variability in the environment here. There's no variability in the feedback processes. The R-star rule will always operate. This is what Gauss said a long time ago. And the superior competitor will always exclude the inferior competitor. The superior competitor, well, what is the superior competitor? The one that has a higher attack rate and conversion efficiency, the higher birth rate relative to the lower death rate. Isn't that beautiful? So this like shows like, oh, well, I don't know what these are, but if you think about it, that's the birth rate, that's the death rate, right? So to be good, intuitively you know, having a high birth rate relative to a death rate will make you be superior, right? It's nothing magical, that's biology, we just made it formal, right? And here's a situation, what's your name? I'm hoping to learn at least most of your names. So we should all have name tags because mine is the hardest, I bet you. I always win in that competition role. So coexistence is not possible in the absence of environmental variability, right? In this particular case, right? Now, that's exploitative competition. And I want to introduce to this idea called apparent competition, which is a bit sort of a subtle thing, okay? So this arises when there are indirect interactions between individuals that share a common natural enemy. So now we are out of competition, okay? Say this is like a predator that attacks two prey. So the prey are not competing for something, right? They are interacting through this natural enemy. So each individual of any prey species affects others solely by changing the abundance of their shared natural enemy. Now let's think about it without thinking of any equations. Let's say there's prey 1 and prey 2 and the predator attacks both. Let's say prey 1 gets eaten a lot. So what prey 1 does is then increases the predator's abundance. Now suddenly there are lots of predator. It kind of has to eat prey 2. So what has happened? Now it starts eating prey 2, right? So prey 1 has had a negative effect on prey 2 by increasing the abundance of their common predator, right? Do you see? That's really easy to understand, right? This is a very general principle. So Robert Holt came up with this idea in 1977. My gosh, you weren't even a glimmer of it in your parents' eyes then. So this idea, which is actually very important, because you can have a shared natural enemy and have mutually negative effects on each other without ever having competed for a resource. That's what we want to now look at. Again, let's think of like two insect species, say fed on, like attacked by a parasite, two plant species that's attacked by a herbivore. Pick your favorite example. So that's a pan competition. But see, there's no competition. They have their own resources. These prey don't actually exploit the common resource. Okay? So you can think of it as any, like, an insect species that feeds on nectar versus an insect species that feeds on leaves. They don't compete. Okay? And I'm using a very, very simple model question.
So from what you just explained, increase the number of prey species 1,
I can still hear you. Oh yeah, of course you're right.
when we increase the number of prey species 1, we increase the number of predators, and therefore it has a negative impact on the number of species 2.
Yeah,
right?
so it could even be that the predator initially just feeds on more of prey 1 for some reason. Maybe it's easily accessible, maybe it's more abundant. Either way, the species then increases the predator abundance. Now the predator needs more prey. Yeah, you're exactly right.
But can we classify that as a positive or negative feedback, or that would be just for the density dependence of the species on itself?
So here the negative effect is on one prey species will have a negative effect on the other prey species. Now they can be limited by their own resources, the prey, right? We're going to forget about that. Of course, in order for each prey species to persist, a very good question, they have to be limited by their own resources. But we are not going to worry about this for the time being. We assume, because I'm using a very simple system, so I can show you something equivalent to the R-star rule. But so I have essentially this is like exponential growth, right? But we could put in a logistic term there. So basically the prey are limited by their own resources. So they can persist in isolation of the predator. Like the predator is not there, both species will be persistent. But now they share this predator and they're not competing, so there shouldn't be any negative. There is a negative feedback within each species, obviously due to intraspecific competition, but there is no negative interactions between the two species because they don't interact. But now they are kind of forced to interact indirectly through the common enemy. So it's like exploitative competition has the same sort of outcome, but through a very different biological mechanism. Okay, excellent questions. So we do the same thing. Now we ask the question, can prey species I increase from small numbers when prey species J is at equilibrium with the predator? And for that to happen, its per capita growth rate when it's rare has to be positive. So we go through, the same exact procedure. So I'll go through this a bit fast. So here, let's say prey species J is at equilibrium with the predator when its per capita growth rate is 0. And now we have something different from R star. There is a predator abundance at which prey species per capita growth rate is 0, and we call that prey species P star, just like we had an R star, right? So that is the predator abundance at which the prey is able to just balance. So meaning this predator is not it's not overexploiting this prey, right? It can still persist. Like there's enough mortality due to predation, but there's also enough births in the prey species to counteract the additional mortality due to predation. Okay? So that's that situation. So that's its P star. So obviously with this very simple model, that P star happens to be this thing. So then we asked about the invasion. So that's simply a summary of what I just said. Now we can write down the invasion criterion for the other species. So when the species J is at equilibrium with the natural enemy, can species I invade this system? And then, so that's the invasion criterion where P star is given by consumer J's the predator abundance at which the consumer J can balance its birth and mortality. Excuse me. I've forgotten the equal sign again. But here, then it happens to be this thing. This is equal sign here. Prey species I can invade if this quantity from here, Ri, this thing is positive, just like the other one. And we have mutual invasibility criteria. Prey species 1 can invade when rare if that quantity is positive, where P star C2 is that. Prey species 2 can invade rare if this quantity is positive, where P star C1 is that thing, just like the other model. And we can come up with these inequalities once again, and we see that the invasion criteria are mutually exclusive. If one species can increase when rare, the other cannot. So this leads to something called the P star rule. The prey species that can withstand the highest natural enemy pressure will exclude others. So, you know, when you think about it, this is a sort of a weird system, like why would you want to invade? But it's the question of, can a predator maintain a coexisting prey community just like a resource can maintain a coexisting consumer community, right? That's the idea. Can a predator or a natural enemy act as a diversity enhancing mechanism? That's why we're asking this question. And in these very simple models, what we are seeing is, well, no, because if there is a prey species that is very, very resistant to predator attack, it's just going to win. And unfortunately, even though the other prey are not competing with it, they're going to be driven extinct because the predator is just going to go to things that are easier to capture, eat, or, you know, otherwise palatable, right? Okay. So again, we have this thing. Remember, we are in a constant environment without variability. P star rule operates, and the prey species that's least susceptible to predation will exclude all others. And you cannot get prey coexistence mediated by a shared natural enemy in the absence of environmental variability. Yes?
Just wanted to make a quick question. What is environmental variability in this case?
So the environmental variability is when you have this feedback mechanism, their strength or their sign changing across space or time. So there's a very rigorous definition of it. It's not just saying the soil changes here or there, right? So heterogeneity exists everywhere. Nothing is homogeneous. But we care about the kind of heterogeneity that can cause these feedback processes to vary in strength. Otherwise, there's no variance in fitness. There has to be variance in fitness, meaning species per capita growth rates have to switch from positive to negative as a result of variation. Otherwise, you're going to have the same thing. So that's also a really important point, because this is where like biologists think the world is really complex, everything is variable. But actually, not all that variability is important unless it leads to variance in fitness. This is why you want to think of it a little bit more sort of in those evolutionary terms, right? fitness is the per capita growth rate. There's nothing magic about fitness. But it's the per capita growth rate, which is actually a very good measure of fitness because you have birth, death, consumption, predation, parasitism, resource acquisition, everything, right? So it's the best measure of fitness if you can actually measure it. But right. Now why does this happen? Oh, sorry. So why is coexistence not possible? Yes?
I just would like to ask about the P rule. When you say that the species that can withstand the highest natural enemy will exclude others, that is assuming the natural enemy can find the other species, the weaker one, when it's already in few numbers, right? Because when you consider nature, usually when the numbers are too few, you have a few numbers of one species, the predator would try to search the other because they have a higher number. It would be easier to find.
Right, so the thing is, regardless of the number, eventually, so you increase when you're rare, right, that's the thing. Your ability to increase when rare depends on the prey that's already at equilibrium with the resource, right? So you're thinking, so here's the thing about invasion criteria. You're asking a situation that's not really met in nature. You're asking if there were a situation where the predator and prey one are existing in isolation, then they're actually abundant, right? They are whatever equilibrium. They're not, that prey is not rare, but can these other species increase? And when its apparent competitor is abundant. So that's basically asking the question, when one prey is abundant, can a prey that's not abundant increase? And of course it can if the predator, because the predator will mostly be feeding on the more abundance. That's what we're asking. So it's actually kind of the opposite of what you're asking, like in the sense that for the very reason you're explaining, that prey will escape that predation because when it's rare, right? But what we are finding is that you can't have both species increasing when rare when they are at low densities. If there will be one that's going to exert more competitive effect on the other. Okay? So if you take each species, there's going to be one that actually increases the predator's abundance to a level higher than the other one. And that one is going to happen. So just think of it like the reverse of the R star. Right? What happens in the R star? You want to reduce the resource level to the lowest, right? So nobody else can persist. What's with the natural enemy? How do you do that? You want the natural enemy to be so high that no other species can come in, right? Now, is the prey driving this? No. The question is, can the natural enemy act as a mechanism of coexistence? Like, can the natural enemy allow prey to coexist? And in this mechanism, no, because if the natural enemy has something like a type 3 functional response, where it always goes away from the low prey to the high prey, so it keeps switching back and forth, then it adds enough nonlinearity for this to be happening. But in our system, and that's what I'm going to show, we don't have that kind of nonlinearity. We just simply have linear functional responses. So the consumption rate increases with prey density, and then in that situation, whichever prey is the hardest for the predator to control is going to win, because any other prey will be more susceptible to the predator. So basically that's the idea. Say, think about like, okay, anything like a disease. Who's going to be more susceptible? Who's going to be actually taken over by the parasite? The ones that are more susceptible, right? There's always going to be a resistant strain. It's like the same argument. Whoever is most resistant to the predator is going to basically persist while everybody else gets eaten to a small number, okay? It's a kind of a tricky idea because it's not really like a prey is not driving this in a conscious sense. We are asking, we flip the question. What we are really asking is just the way a resource can be partitioned and allow coexistence, can a predator act as a shared natural enemy act as that? So the way that would work is when each space rare, the predator keeps attacking the other one. But that's not true, because it depends on, say the one is abundant but it's really hard to catch, and you have something that's coming up but it's easier to catch, it might switch because we are not having this preference built into it, okay? So that's the idea. It's a very, very good question because you're kind of asking the real fundamental assumption of these very simple models. So in fact, what we need is a model where you have search rate, attack rate, all these things built in, and we can extend that. And then it gets more complicated, right? This is a very simple one for me to illustrate this idea that there are situations in which local nonlinearity due to dynamics is just simply is not sufficient, okay? All right, so again, what we find is that exploitative and apparent competition in constant environments do not lead to stable coexistence of species because you need this negative feedback. Per capita growth rates have to be declining functions of species densities, and to see why this doesn't work, look at the per capita growth rates of the competitor and the apparent competitor. Do you see these being a function of C? They're not, right? They're not a function, so they're actually independent of the consumer. Each species densities, so that this violates the fundamental tenet of persistence, which is that you don't have negative feedback in these species. You have negative feedback in the resource or the predator, we don't care, right? See, these species do not have any negative density dependence in this way that we have built this, because to generate that, you need some more sort of nonlinearity. Basically, we have to say these species are limited by their own resources, but there's no fun in that, right? You just added it there. It's easy to write an equation where the prey also are limited by mutual interference or something like, you know, the kind of a, but that's us being mathematicians without good biological insight. Let's keep playing with the model until we get the results we like. But that's not what we are after. We are after what might actually be likely to be operating in nature, okay? All right, let me see. So here, let me summarize this part and then we can go to lunch. So the reason we have this situation is that you have exclusion due to insufficient nonlinearity in local dynamics through these consumer resource dynamics to allow for mutual invisibility. So the first condition is itself not satisfied, right? There is no interior attractor. You see, right? Every time is sort of one wins at the expense of the others. So like directional selection, this is sort of basically that is competitive dominance or pan-competitive dominance, which is the exact same thing as directional selection, except we are looking at it at a different level of organization, not alleles, genotypes, but species. But it's the exact same thing. So right, so then we have to ask this question. Coexistence, so we talked about, so this is my idea, but we are asking this question where can nonlinearity alone provide sufficient negative feedback? That is what we are looking at, right? Because the other lectures will deal with the other cases. One second. So basically, we are asking this question of, is there enough negative feedback, sufficient negative feedback arising from species interactions alone in the absence of any variation, absence of spatial or temporal variation, and so far we have not found it. Okay, question.
So the non-linearity of these equations you show is that they're not dependent on density. That's what makes them non-linear.
It's not generating the actual definition of negative density field dependence, which is that anytime you can actually look at it, you know what's fun about this? Somebody writes an equation, a model in a paper, you just look for that, and then you can say, haha, I know what's going to happen. But of course, if you have 3 species, it's not a single equation, but I'm going to show you how to calculate the 3 species, like the per capita growth rate. Yeah.
And could it be non-linear and have and be density dependent, and could it be like not non-linear enough?
That could be true. The example we show, there's no nonlinearity, and there can be situations where it's insufficiently nonlinear. But generally, with local dynamics, I'll show you a case. In fact, that's my second. The next one is where you have actually enough nonlinearity through, you can generate negative feedback through local nonlinearity, But there's a condition to be satisfied, which is it sufficient to generate mutual invisibility and coexistence? So that's actually very good. You're very good. You're actually anticipating my next thing. So that's what I want to do, which we will do tomorrow, which is now, are there situations when you can get coexistence via nonlinearity alone? But we already know the answer, right? We know that that requires sufficient negative density dependence in each species per capita growth rate. So of course, we have to demonstrate from a biological viewpoint that that can happen. And I'm going to do that next time, so I'll introduce you. So this one is this idea of interspecific trade-offs leading to partitioning of resources or natural enemies. And this other one called relative nonlinearity, where species have differential nonlinear responses to a resource or natural enemy that give them an advantage when they're rare. So don't worry about it. I'm going to but they are very different and very, very interesting. And each of those are not as simple as some people make out. So people say if there are trade-offs, you'll get coexistence. Not true at all. Trade-offs will only lead to coexistence if they generate sufficient nonlinearity such that each species can limit itself more than it limits the other species. And that's a much harder thing to demonstrate than to say this species is good in this thing, this species is good in this thing, therefore coexistence does not happen. Okay? So that's what I want to teach you next time. Great. Any questions? No? Great. Okay. All right. So we will meet tomorrow. Well, I will meet you before that, but tomorrow at this time at 11. All right. Now, let's go. Hi.
To ask you a probably basic question.
Yeah.
How do we know the handling time of a parasite? It will be the same